Hello, welcome everyone to the last NATS chat of the 2023-24 season. I'm Kari Ragan, moderator of NATS Chats, and I am so thrilled to welcome my guest, Chris Johnson, tonight, and my dear friend and colleague, Lynn Maxfield, who will help co-moderate this NATS chat. Thank you both for being here.
Good evening.
Thank you.
And of course, I want to begin by just thanking Inside View Press, who has yet again been the sponsor of NATS Chats this year. We are so grateful to them. Please check out their book, Kinesthetic Voice Pedagogy 2 by Ken Bozeman. It is available to purchase at www.voxped.com or on Amazon. So be sure to check that out and to thank Scott McCoy and Inside View for their sponsorship again this year. So today we are going to talk mix and match, piecing together the puzzle of mixed register. So thank you again, Chris and Lynn, for being here. Chris, why don't we just begin? Would you please introduce yourself a little bit to us? Share with us, I know you're in England, and so share with us a little bit about your background.
Well, yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate you inviting me on, and it's great to be here. Yeah, so my background, it didn't actually start in singing. Well, it kind of did, you know, just in the bathroom in a hairbrush, that type of thing. But I didn't really take it seriously for many, many years. I just sort of joined a choir. I did get paid a little bit to sing on the weekend. But as life tends to do, it kicks you up the bum when you really should do something. And so what I did is I actually ended up going on what you'd call the rat race for about 10 years until there was, if anybody can remember this, is the financial crash of 2007. This sounds very boring. I'm not going to talk about subprime mortgage markets. all to say was I was watching the news in 2007 and they said, oh, this bad things happened about mortgages. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And the next day I had a box to put all my things in, literally the next day. So because I was working in financial company. So from that, there was this point where it's like, okay, I'm redundant. I was a contractor, so I had no benefits. But so that just meant I had to do what was making money for me right there and then. And on the side, it was singing. So singing, I was like, right, I've got some business skills. I know how to do a spreadsheet and I'm good at sales. And that was enough to get enough gigs to start paying rent again, which was, you know, it was hairy, don't get me wrong. But with my very last bit of credit card headroom, I bought a piano, the one I still play today. It's right here next to me. Because I just teach online anyway, I don't need anything fancy. So I bought that and I bought a second-hand Mac laptop. And then that last little bit of cash I had, I took teacher training. Because what I'd actually done was when I got forced, I enjoyed getting into singing, but when I got into it, the thing that I realized was if I'm going to do this full time, I started singing 4 times a week, and then my voice gave out. It just was not, I was just not ready. I was untrained professional, as you'd probably call me. So I went for voice lessons, and they saved me, basically. I thought I was going to have to quit another career. So if you take that moment, that's my pivotal moment of going, oh, I sorted myself out. I can enjoy this career now, and I did for 15 years. But now there is an opportunity for me to go, I'm really interested in this. So I learned coaching myself, and that's where the journey began for singing for me, because I just found it very interesting. And that led on to working with singers, and then through opportunities I got through organizations I work with, I became a teacher mentor, and then from mentoring it went on to more sort of group teacher training and larger events, and now I have a company called teachvoice.com where I mentor large numbers of teachers into the industry as well as coach.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Isn't it? It's so amazing the older we get to trace back to recognize the pivotal moments in our life where something just profoundly shifted for the better, ultimately, when we can reflect back. So yeah. I love that story. That's amazing, Chris. Thank you for sharing. Well, our topic today, as we know, is mixed registration, which, as we all know, can be a bit of a minefield, semantic minefield, as Scott McCoy says. So let's start with a couple biomechanical truths. Let's, in all conversations in voice, I like to start with, from a science-informed approach, what do we know? We all know there's magic involved, right? Especially in the application, but I think a lot of it can be grounded in science. So I appreciate that. So let me just say this. It is now accepted that registration is both a physiological laryngeal source event and an acoustic event, harmonic resonance interaction, that cannot be separated. And that's Bozeman 2013, Coffin 1987. The dynamic negotiation of both muscular activity and acoustic adjustments is crucial to the mastery of singing. And what's interesting about that is that's relatively new, this idea that it's not just laryngeal source. I mean, we're moving on down the road, but that thinking is not been around forever. Let's just talk about that idea, that concept for just a minute. What would you guys say about it being both laryngeal source and acoustic?
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And when you look at the combinations of how it can occur, sometimes you're looking at what people have just controlled in the past, and sometimes people feel like they just control their voice and they don't care about the vowel. They might go along the lines of, well, for me, it's just really what goes on at the larynx. And then there might be other ways of training or singing that are very much based around acoustics. And so they might say, actually, voice source is very consistent through, but really it's about what goes on in the vowels or the shapes and whatnot. But then when we take certain events and combine them, you can approach a shouty resonance with a lighter register, or you can passaggio in terms of covered tone, where the second harmonic surpasses the first formant, but you can still be effectively in chest voice at the larynx level. And when that happens, you tend to feel a lightening of the register, but maybe what it is, it's not really a changing out of chest, but it's a distinct change in the energy of the vocal tract. And that energy in the vocal tract can trigger this feeling of like, oh, some of the load has left me. And it doesn't necessarily mean, oh, I'm in the next register, laryngeal register now, but it's just all those never-ending combinations of what you could put in and out. And then how much closure you apply increases the amount of energy in the vocal tract, which increases the effects of harmonics crossing through formants. You can feel them quite strongly when they're of high energy. So when you throw all that into the mix, yes, they can't be separated, but you get a myriad of combinations.
Yeah, I think on a perceptual level, you're absolutely right. It's not an either or, that you're choosing to do one or the other. And that's both the listener perception and the performer perception, right? But I think what's nice is that we have been able to see with some instrumentation, we can see acoustic shifts happening and changing in the levels of the acoustic energies at different frequencies, while simultaneously watching EGG data and seeing that the laryngeal the closed quotient or contact is not changing, that we would expect to see in a laryngeal registration event. So I think we can see that they are two separate things, and hear that we must combine them. We must navigate them together, and that's the minefield of singing. That's why you can spend an hour or months talking about mixed registration.
Oh, that's a great way to launch this. So are we all in agreement, though, that mix is not a separate register? We've just discussed that there's these kinds of blurred lines, but we are in agreement that when people talk about mixed register, it's not like there's mode 1, mode 2, and then this third register. Sorry, I know there's 4, but this magic mixed register.
Yeah. Chris, I'll defer to you, but I will say from my perspective, I don't see a lot of functionality in addressing it as its own entity, as addressing mixed as operating separate from either a mechanism 1 or a mechanism 2.
Mm. Yeah, and you know, sometimes people just define mix as when someone sort of reduces intensity a little bit, and they go, "Oh, you're going more mixy there," and it's just a label for sometimes intensity. But you know, as we've been discussing, you know, sometimes it's if we talk about the things we've spoken about, Kari, which is some of the theories that come from 𝘕𝘂𝘛𝘚, whereby his definition of mix can offer some explanation as to why it's not a separate register, but rather it's a register led by one of the simpler functional registers, but that has some alterations around it. And you know, if we can define in part a laryngeal register as which layer of the vocal fold is dominantly vibrating and dictating the pitch. So in the low pitches, that can be the muscle layer, the TA, vocalis, whatever you want to call it. When that one is in its strongest vibration and its intention, it can lead the pitch and it can lead the entire vibration of the vocal folds and influence them. And then you get this chestier perception. And then when the vocal folds stretch out, that layer becomes far too stiff to do that job. And then the ligament layer, which is the one just outside of it, is far more able to vibrate well at those higher frequencies and those longer lengths and tensions. And those can be sort of the basic ingredients to mix register. And then so the arguments out there are that you can't mix those two things together, you know, that muscle layer and that ligament layer, they will not work. And there's a lot of anger out there about it sometimes, but and that argument is like, yes, no, that's true, but that's really not what's being described. What's being described by someone like Ingo, which is until you guys like reduce your ethics and let us stick needles in people where we want to. It's
you
your
first,
fault.
Chris.
Yeah. I'm at the front of the queue.
I will say Ingo's done it. Ingo's done it. I have never volunteered to do it. I have never had hooked wire EMG.
No, but I remember Ingo saying it's like in the 80s, wasn't it? It was like early 80s. Ingo was like, yeah, just go for it. But
and even he said I wouldn't do it, you know, volitionally very often. So no. I get what you're saying, but I want to just point out how nicely you described the depth of vibration with the two different mechanisms or modes, however you want to talk about it. But how you're talking about in our lower register, whatever name you want to ascribe to that, the mass of the vocal fold or of the muscle of the TA is what is driving the vibration, and therefore it is vibrating as well. But as it continues to stiffen and contract and stiffen, it gets too dense and too stiff to continue to vibrate, and so therefore, and then the driver of the vibration moves outward, and you get the mass of the mucosa that is now driving the vibration, and that is really the crux of laryngeal registration. And I love how you described that so well. So, you know, kudos to you.
No worries. And yeah, the piece of the puzzle where then as maybe one of Ingo's theories would go, and that I actually see some value in it in the way that I work pedagogically, is that when there comes a point, and everybody will know this as vocal coaches and singers, there comes a point where in the middle of the range, the ligament and the vocal folds are at such a certain length and tension that the ligament layer becomes very able to vibrate, but also the muscle layer is still able to vibrate at that point in time. And that's the sort of crunch point where they're at similar tensions, and you're able to hand over or let that dominant vibration move, like you say, move outward, but more smoothly. And you have to do that, as we all know, at some point in the break of the voice, gradually. And the way sometimes mix, I think, can be bigger is that the coordination that is proposed by someone like Dr. 𝘕𝘂𝘛𝘚 is that as that ligament layer becomes the dominant vibration, if you do nothing else much with it, it might sound like falsetto, way too small, way too thin. But if that muscle layer can loosen off its stiffness a little bit and let the vocal folds lengthen, it can do two jobs. It can become loose enough to be affected by the vibration of the neighboring ligament. And what that means is then that's called entrainment, where two things or where one thing moves the thing next to it and they influence each other. The ability for the ligament vibration to entrain the muscle vibration means you get a little bit more of that vocal fold mass in vibration than you would normally. So that will give you a sense of a heavier register. But obviously the effect of the thyroretinoid or TA muscle is also to provide some depth of thickness in the vocal fold. So that might bring some of that sort of plane, if you like, of adduction into the mix, where you get, it's effectively led by a falsetto type mechanism, right? Or mode rather of vibration, but it's bringing enough of the rest of the tissue along with it in order to provide that. And as we've discussed, you know, that's a tricky thing to do and may even be down in some parts of vocal fold morphology and genetics of how big that could be or how robust that could be.
Well, I'm so grateful to have this detailed conversation about ligament versus muscle, because as I said to you, Chris, it was episode 20 of the Naked Vocalist podcast that you had Ingo on all those years ago. And I remember it was a brief mention that he made, and I thought, wow, we're not talking about this because enough. Like, I don't think we're understanding it very much. So you've explained it beautifully, especially because at the time we had become entrenched in this CT dominant, TA dominant language, which I think, you know, back in 2005 with Scott McCoy's book, which was so incredibly helpful to voice teachers to understand that we could talk at a physiological level about what was happening. And we forget that 18, 19 years ago, that was still a profound shift in our profession. Now we've moved away from that, right? But it helped these conversations get started. Don't you think that's that background of CTTA, like what was useful about that you think has served us? And why do we need to continue to move away from it?
Yeah, well, like I think a lot of people have experienced it. Allowed them a sort of an entry point into anatomical ideas and descriptions. So, and I know when I first started learning pedagogy, you know, I was doing a lot of it by observation, experimentation, some core concepts. But then this sort of language brought me further into that sort of rabbit hole of what might go on under the hood, which is great, you know, at times overwhelming. And, you know, I certainly think you just need to be exposed to this kind of language over and over again for it to sort of become second nature. I did glaze over for the first couple of years. No offense to Ingo, but when he first wrote a subscript N in my in my lecture, I was like, can I leave? I'd like to leave now. But I was just not ready for algebra at that point. I'm like, I'm just doing scales, Ingo. Okay. Anyway, but you know, a few years down the line, I can just about look at those things. But so it does bring you into that world, yes. But the thing about TA and CT dominance as language is, one thing is you can never know. Let's put it that way. You can never really know unless you're at the extremes of the range which one's going to be truly dominant. Also, does it matter? I'm not sure it really matters so much, but I think one of the key points of it is, which I think maybe is where it just comes slightly unstuck, but it's cool, is the connection between the word TA dominant and the sound of chest. That's the sticky point. Because if we look at psychoacoustics, for example, chest voice is really defined in the listener as the presence of high frequency harmonics or high frequency content in the signal. Let's say it's like loads of strong stuff above 4,000 hertz. When that's really strong, we hear this heavier register. And when that goes down, we hear this lighter register. So when you have that, you start to go, oh, and if you have a lot of it, you might go, wow, that sound is really TA dominant. There's a lot of that sound of that in there. But that sound is actually mostly gathered by vocal fold closure. So the stronger the closure you have, the more those high frequency harmonics tend to go up, obviously past a certain point. But so we may confuse this TA dominant sound that we see as chest voice, we may confuse it with just high adduction, which could be in any register, to be fair. It doesn't have to be chest, it could be head, it could be anything. Equally, and I by the way, this is not just information. When I work with teachers who use that language and we assess sounds, these are the confusions that they lie into. And what you might have noticed from that last scenario is that from the language of TA dominance, they would select the exact opposite solution that singer needs, because it is not it. And equally in the bottom, one of the most common ones was when people hear a breathy low end, they say it's CT dominant, because breathiness is often confused with headiness. And so you get this problem of adduction again. You're like, well, you know, I can reasonably assume if it's a low voice and they're below F3, I can't see how that could possibly be in a falsetto register functionally. The ligament is too loose by then. It has to be something able to vibrate, and that's a muscle. That's the TA. But the adduction is so low that it sounds like head voice, and so it gets given a CT dominance, right? But what it does, it just needs closure. That's what it needs. So yeah, that language in pedagogical choices can lead people down the garden path a little bit.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you've said, and I think I would just add that I think the problem with focusing on just the muscle activity dominance is it ignores the piece of exactly what you were just talking about with the level of adduction or amount of adduction, and thereby lung pressure, right? That's the other variable in both intensity and pitch. Is you have muscle closure and mechanism of vibration or mode of vibration. That's not mode of vibration, mechanism, and lung pressure. Those are the controlling factors. And so if we just look at CTTA activation, we're ignoring the adduction part. And that really is a lot of what comes into play with what we hear on the end radiated sound signal.
Yeah, it's part of the trickery, isn't it? You know, when you hear, how do they sing chest voice that high? And sometimes you just kind of like, well, maybe on a functional level, it's not chest voice that high. It's just maintaining a level of closure and lung pressure that feeds a frequency range that makes you think it is. And then when singers interpret that, they hear chest voice all the way up. They try and do chest voice all the way up. Doesn't go well because it is. And that's why we're in jobs as singing teachers, because there's so many misconceptions and also paradoxes in what we hear and what might be a functional reality. So often they are opposites.
But coming back to Kari's original point of, it was useful language. It helped us get into this discussion. And I'll get on my soapbox here for just a moment and encourage us all as we get new information. Doesn't matter what field we're talking about. There is psychoacoustics or neuroscience or just basic acoustics. As we get new information, I really want us as a community to be adding that information and building up, and not posing it in a place of beating down the person who's still using the older terminology. There's a real tendency as we share information to shame the person who doesn't have the piece of information that you have. And I really want us to get away from that. I see it so often in social media spaces that I really am. Yeah, that's my soapbox. Let's not do that. Let's build on what we have.
Yeah, I'm so grateful that you say that, Lynn, because we do see that on social media, because sometimes it's shocking that somebody says something that we've known we've moved on from 10 years ago, but that's okay. They're coming to that in their own time. And when they know better, they're going to do better. So,
and frankly, we are all on a Yeah, and frankly, we're all on a path to the next level of understanding. And if we waited to fully understand everything before we applied anything, we'd be waiting forever.
Yeah.
So, you know.
I used to always say in my PED class at the beginning of every year, I'd say, listen, check with me in next year because I don't know how much of this will still be true. You know?
Well, to be fair, when you engage, it's a world of caveats, isn't it? So just a word, it just lets you get out later. We need those.
Well, and it really comes down to trying to understand the rationale of whoever is using the language that we may not fully agree with anymore. And I've been full-time employed in this field for 13 years now. I've never met a single voice teacher who truly was maliciously trying to apply wrong information. Never, not once. And so we have to understand that they're all coming at it from trying to lift up their client. So anyway, that's my feel-good moment for the day.
I love that. Thank you, Lynn. It's a good day for a feel-good moment. And speaking of language, let's just live for just a moment this idea of mechanism versus mode. I know when I was writing my book, I debated and debated, which do I say, and read all sorts of different things. So you had such a beautiful explanation about where the confusion or the one little caveat to whether we say mode 1 or mechanism 1. So
well, my understanding is that whatever confusion there is, or whatever disagreement there is, stems from the fact that within the world of acoustics, mode already has a meaning, right? Mode already has a definition, a mode of vibration. And if we're talking about the vocal folds that are vibrating, when they change mechanisms, they're not really changing modes of vibration. And so for clarity, I tend to use mechanism if I'm going to use that language at all. But it comes down to level setting with whoever you're talking to and making sure that you're using the same terminology the same way. And so if I'm talking with Ingo, I usually don't use the word mode because he understands mode in a very different context. But I just don't use mode very often, but I don't shame anybody that still does, because it has been pointed out or it has been in the vernacular for a while and in the published literature. So it's completely understandable.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, just to answer, Dan Mitten asks in the questions, is mode a truncation of eigenmodes of the mucosal wave?
That's a question for me.
Yes.
Yeah, let me talk to Ingo and get back to you. I think that was I think that's exactly his confusion with it, because I don't think we see true eigenmode differences between M0, M1, and M2. And so that's what confuses him and me, for that matter. We're not seeing modal shifts. We're actually just seeing mechanisms. I think mechanism becomes a little bit more global because it does involve the vibration of the vocal folds, the depth of vibration, and the glottal closure, like we've talked about.
Mm.
But it's not a hill I'm willing to die on. Right?
No, okay.
Okay.
I'm so grateful you were here to take that question, Lynn Maxfield.
I'll fall on it. Sure.
Thank you very much. There's a couple questions in the question box that I think will lead us to application, because that's what we're all thrilled to discuss, right? But I wanted to start with some biomechanical conversation. But let's head into some application, Chris. So here, Sandra Drew has asked, how would you define head mix if you were to put it into a formula? Not application, but.
Oh, I mean, that's a tricky question, but I mean, I think it all has to be partly perceptual as well, because head mix is, it may sound different from certain people. And when you're talking about directors in musical theatre, for example, they ask you for something, they've got a very specific idea of what that is in their head. And that might be quite different to the idea you've got in your head about how much weight or intensity that is within that. But I think if you're gonna try and find the gradient of mixes, if you like, going from the lightest register to the heaviest, most intense, if you like, then I think I would explore, if I was that person, I would explore versions of 𝘕𝘕 That's what I would do. I would, if that person can find a light register that is adducted, not breathy, but it's got some closure about it and it's clear, and using certain aspects, whether it's a straight up 𝘕𝘕, which is a crescendo on a single vowel, that can be possible. Or you can put no, 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 no. You can put consonants on it to stabilize it, for example, because it can be very difficult on a single vowel. Mary Saunders Barton goes, ooh, you, and she kind of goes, she uses specific words to move between, and then to the bigger one. So versions of that will allow, I think it was Sandy who said that in the questions.
Yes.
Will allow Sandy to find out, either in their clients or in themselves, when they go into some of those crescendos, where they feel head mix would be, and then they can define their own equation. Oh, so that's a little bit more reduction, it requires a little bit more, maybe they call it support or something. I don't know, maybe the vowel is better open slightly, who knows? But then you can, I think you can define your own equation, Sandy, rather than me imposing my idea of what it could be or should be.
It's so singer dependent, isn't it? That's why these these conversations are challenging, because it depends on where we start with that individual singer. You know, their level of training, the type of genre that they've trained with, the type of genre they're interested in, and their basic vocal makeup, right? And so how we might pepper different things into the mix, I don't mean mix registration, but into the mix of singing, the intensity, the vowel, the pitch, right? Yep. The conversation then moves from there, which is what you were just getting at, Chris, I think.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Also from Sandy, for a female voice, at what starting pitch does the lowest mix start, and where is the top pitch mix?
Oh, blimey. Okay, so I think the low part of mix is a really important one, and I remember in pedagogy, when I was going quite deep down into the world of registers, and also in combination with things that might be called functional training now, some of the stuff that Cornelius Reed might be famous for example, is when you look at the capacity for the ligament to be in a ligament vibration type mode, so in almost like effectively a head voice or a falsetto. You can stay in it really, really low, and a lot of people define mix as starting at F, starting at G or something, because that's where the break is at regular volume. But really, if you decrease the volume and walk down, all those laryngeal events, they change places. And that's what intensity does. Intensity encourages the vibrations of certain layers. So as you reduce the intensity of the volume, which reduces the amount of breath pressure, the shock waves into the vocal folds don't go in quite as far, and you tend to localize those vibrations closer to the edge of the vocal folds. So you'll get less in vibration, lighter register. And you tend to find, actually, I tend to find, regardless of voice type, on the bottom end, anybody can remain in what might be a mix if they're quiet enough, down to F3. And when you get below F3, it seems like you can't deny chest voice anymore, even though chest voice will absolutely go much higher than that. That means that's what I call in my pedagogy the shared range, because there's a great chunk of range, more than an octave for some people, where you can easily, comfortably be in either on the ligament and in mixed register or head register, or in full out chest voice without overstretching either. You can be in those in a more than an octave. So when it comes to the pedagogy of training mix, quite often, yes, people are training it above the break at regular volume, but when you actually practice being able to descend below your regular break point and remain in that lighter register, when you go to those stronger sounds, they seem to blend better at the right point, because what you're teaching your nervous system now is you're teaching your nervous system the boundaries of those functions. You know, there's a lot that goes on in the back office, not conscious, but the more you train, and you know, taking your chest voice up a bit further than it would normally go is part of that training. It's understanding what's the limit safety wise with that, and then going down, and that gives your nervous system an opportunity to actually figure out what's the optimum place for this all to start handing over. So yeah, I put a lot of joy down to the training singers in the light register below their break, and then increasing intensity afterwards. So yeah, Sandy, I'd say that the bottom end of that is easier to answer in the way that I train people, but as far as how far it goes on the top, I mean, I have no idea. Functionally, I have no idea. How it sounds, I mean, it can go up very far as it sounds. You listen to someone like Aretha Franklin, it sounds like it goes all the way up to like A5, for example. But again, I think that's going to be down to voice type as well, the thickness of the mucosal layer. Some people will thin out earlier than others, and it's nothing to do with skill. Yeah.
Keeping on the application side here, in that shared range, and I like that terminology, and I use something similar, which is why I like it. I tend to use either same pitch and changing intensity to manage that change, that shift in that shared register, or same intensity and crossing pitch. How do you decide which direction to go, and do you have some exercises that like do both, or I'm trying to learn here from you, Chris.
Oh, cool. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm happy to share some of my approaches. Yes, so I do. I think it's sometimes a revelation for teachers to understand that working on the break, and if we say the break is, as a lot of people say, it's a break between pitches. So often the mixed register, or even just how you're smoothing out the middle, is so often defined by what pitch you're on. It happens at this pitch. Oh, that means I have to work from low to high, and I have to smooth it out through a pitch-based thing. But going back to 𝘕𝑚 voce, the muscles that coordinate pitch smoothly coordinate volume smoothly as well. So a 𝘕𝑚 voce, even if it's below the break point, let's say that they normally break at F sharp. Can you hear that piano, by the way? Are you okay? So I wasn't sure whether it was rooted in. To practice 𝘕𝑚 voce on D below it, no. That is as valuable as going through that break, because that D, you can feasibly be in, both a ligament vibration or or a muscle layer vibration. I know. Thanks for the support, Mac. You're doing great, Chris.
Fantastic.
It's great. I got to switch that thing off. Anyway,
webinar enthusiasm. Keep you going.
I know.
I love
like it. So that's as valuable an exercise for training the break, because it's involving all of those different muscles that do the same thing. So I'd say that's really valuable. The directions I choose become purely experimental, and that's why I feel like my teaching process is incredibly messy, because I like to uncover as many stones as possible. So I don't tend to say, oh, we come from the top down and we build it on the lighter place and make it thicker. Equally, I come from the bottom quite often, because actually when you look at the way singers work, if we take some principles from functional training, which is the pattern that you use and the intensity that you use, and I tend to manage the intensity via character. Some people might use emotion, but I tend to use something called character. So if I was going to say, take a pattern that went from low to high, like that thing, ooh, something like that, and that's an A flat. So I know really that's going to be going above the place that I normally feel I'm going to be transitioning in, right? But if I keep my energy up, ooh, if I think about I'm excited, but I can also think about ooh, letting go a little bit as well. Because if my sense of chest and falsetto, my sense of the weight of the register is a little bit detached from my sense of intensity, because they can be different. You can still have an intense head voice, it doesn't have to be a quiet thing. And what I tend to do with singers is, with quiet experimental language, I tend to get them to start thinking about playing with chest and falsetto as just basic instructions, mixing that with the pattern and the intensity which I manage via character. I can usually get a really good result there. And what I'm doing is I'm trading off a bit. I'm kind of going, well, the pattern and the intensity is involving the thickness in that sound. It's going to make the register heavier. But when they choose to let go a little bit, it all balances itself out. So it becomes an exploration of language, and somewhat trading off of certain things until you find something that works. And that's what's quite exciting about all this, is that I don't have a particular method, but I just take a few principles that I know will affect the vocal folds in particular ways, and I play with them. And when I take that sort of functional training, if I put one thing on this side, which is the acoustics, as we mentioned, you can't detach from acoustics, but I tend to include a sound that I know will be quite resonant in a way that supports the vocal folds. So quite often I use, thanks to 𝘱𝘓𝘁 Ballantyne, I use a lot of R. I've developed something that I just call myself the wah guitar, which is this thing, which is a very high tongue and slightly nasal. And it really, yes, that's an A flat. So that helps you to find that thinner place. That's how I help thinner places just be more supported acoustically, whilst the singer is able to find them. And when you come away from so much wow, so much like weird sound, wow, you tend to be able to sit on those ones. You just come away and the space between the tongue and the palate opens a little bit. And for anybody who's into acoustics, just that little bit of narrowing in the beginning just helps to keep some of that acoustic energy in, and it helps somebody to explore that register in a more supported way. And then when they open that up a little bit, if they put their foot on the gas in terms of intensity, they tend to find this new thing. And that's when I come from the lighter side and then make it thicker. And that's usually more of a top-down version. So I have a couple of ways that I approach it, but it all becomes very fluid. And when you boil it down, although it looks messy as hell, it really just comes down to 4 principles at the end of the day. It's very much like pitch, pattern, intensity, and some acoustic support. And then playing around with language that works with the singer, that is actually actionable on stage. You know, that's the way I tend to approach the basic training of it.
Mm-hmm. Great explanation. And somebody asked a question, but the vowel, of course, is critical in these conversations as well as intensity. Right, Chris, when you're playing, of course, the vowel that you choose would be critical in helping them explore those boundaries, correct?
Yes, it is. It is. And in recent years, I think I've tried to find solutions that tie the singer to the vowel less.
Okay.
Because when I look at the job of a singer, my job is usually to try and take overwhelm away from them. And sometimes it feels like, oh, I have to plan every single vowel on this thing. And do you know what? When we get to extremes of range, and you tend to, when you get really high as a soprano, it's like there's not much left, is there, in terms of vowels? It's all got to be a very similar thing. But in the contemporary ranges, up to say D5 and E flat 5 and whatnot, we can be somewhat absolved of being so close with the vowel and so in a management state with the vowel if we have some level of acoustic support that is vowel agnostic, if that's even a phrase. And so forms of twang can offer you that. They allow you to be able to say more of the stuff on the lips without falling off at the back. And the wah guitar is one of those things that I've just demonstrated there, because a slightly raised tongue at the back is one of those things that can remain constant whilst everything else is changing. And you tend to find that with singers can't find their mix, or they fall off it very frequently, is because when they move from a closed to an open vowel, ooh, ah, ooh, ah, it all tends to splat around, and there's no consistency in that. You could muscle your way through that with more heavy adduction, and that does kind of work, but it's kind of risky and fatiguing. But when there's some complexity of like widenings and narrowings that happen in the voice, you can get away with much fewer instructions. And the wah guitar, for example, if anybody was to try it now, wow, because that sound is very much funneled into that tiny little opening between the roof of the mouth and the tongue, it tends to concentrate a lot of the sensations of resonance to that area, right by the soft palate to hard palate junction. And when you have that and you play around with that a little bit, if you bring that to the singer's awareness, you might notice in old pedagogy, a lot of mixed register is actually described to be that. It's described to go up in that direction. And so in some way, those instructions of placement are, I think, are trying to reorder that vocal tract into a higher tongue position, right, without knowing it. But what I tend to do is and this is not the only thing I use, but if we do wah guitar and we get that high position, they can feel it, as they open that vowel, my instruction to them is try and shape yourself in the way that actually retains some of that feeling, so you come in little grades more open. And that way they tend to be able to then attach themselves to a sensation that manages the tongue position for them, and then hence they end up feeling more stable especially if they have to do a lot of articulation in the high pitches. There's a nice constant support there, and that's one example of how I think that helps up in the top range.
Wonderful. Go ahead, Lynn, did you?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I had myself muted. My apologies. But there was another question, and I do think it's worth exploring here, of does the age of the student influence the ease of mixing? And, you know, I tend to work with two groups of people. I've got the 18 to 25 set, and then I've got the over 60 set. And I don't have a lot of the folks in the middle here, and I would love to hear your thoughts on age and vocal fold morphology and how that influences the vibration.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's that is a bit of a minefield. I mean, vocal fold morphology. There was a really great article by Christiane Herbst in the NATS thing, Snake Pit of whatever it's called. I just type in Snake Pit and it comes up on my computer. So that's all okay, yeah, so it's called Snake Pit if anybody wants it. But so in that there is the mention, which also corroborated by a lot of the ENTs that I talked to as well, about those people with larynxes of steel. You know, they can just crack it out no matter what state they're in. It's just there, never any breaks, up and down. But they might notice a thicker mucosal layer in that. That's important. Well, I think between us, we all have very different thicknesses in the morphology of the mucosal layer, and that will result in someone who sounds more chesty. And the mucosal layer being such a jelly-like structure is it can stabilize vibration through the tricky parts of the voice. So having that means you don't even need to get that skillful with the middle of your break. It can help you through it. And when harmonics and formants are all over the place and you're going through dead spots and whatnot, that morphology can keep you moving. So that's an important thing to note about morphology, I think. Hence, not striving for everybody to achieve the same thing. And that's what you get. A lot of the arguments on social media are, you know, maybe some purists are like, this person is just not good enough, not skillful enough. And it's like, no, genetics are often part of this. So it's important. When it comes to the, let's say, singers going through hormonal changes on the young side of things, like puberty, Resonance is an incredible leveler for the mixed register, because obviously, especially young boys go through a nightmare. Of course, we all go through the nightmare in the middle, but resonance, I've found, has been an incredible stabilizer and speeder upper, if you like, of helping them to actually have those registers interact with each other when they're getting out the other side of it, like 16, 17, 18. So that can make things quite tricky. And the way I do that, by the way, is I would tend to use a Y buzz. And if anybody knows what a Y buzz is, it's an E vowel with a round lip. And if you bring that into an O vowel, you tend to get this sort of nice thick resonance that carries over from one vowel to the other. It's quite a good one. And when you use that in the young males, if you like, if you're already starting on this kind of resonance lean, if you like, then when you quickly jump to a falsetto and back down again, that falsetto comes through much thicker and much quicker, because you've set the voice up to actually rely on resonance. And the first thing that the voice seems to want to do is keep it. It wants to stay on it. And as long as there's not much shape change, then the resonance support you get inside the voice will probably not change either. Not much anyway. And so traversing registers like that can be much less dicey, much less strained. So I use that rather a lot when I feel like somebody's having a lot of trouble in that part, in the young people. But as we know, when people get a lot older as well, the shape of the mucosa can change considerably with hormones in things like menopause, for example. The fluid retention in the vocal folds can make them so much bigger. The influx of testosterone can change it. It becomes very tricky. And if we think about vibrating layers, and actually the purpose of us being able to mix or even smooth out the break, is our job is to skillfully find the pitches and the intensities whereby the muscle layer and the ligament layer can reach very similar vibrations, very similar frequencies, so that they have a possibility of handing off that dominant vibration gradually. And that sometimes is a lifetime's work, isn't it? And then suddenly, when you get a change in morphology of the vocal folds from an influx of something like hormones, that location is disturbed. Now the layers vibrate at different frequencies than they did 5 years ago. And it's the same for puberty going in the other direction. So it can be very, very challenging. And so we are trying to help singers to understand that. That's why maybe ladies going through the menopause would then suddenly go, okay, I've just got to face the idea that now my transition area is lowered because everything has changed down there. Pardon me. And that's why we really need to help singers with as much support as possible in order to find that again.
Chris, we support good vocal health here. You can take a drink of water.
Oh, cheers.
Always good vocal health first.
So I appreciate that, and acknowledging that that age doesn't affect everyone the same, and everybody's baseline at any given day is different, and so always approaching the lesson with a level of individualism, right? In individualized attention. I think where it becomes challenging, this is from my perspective of I do tend to work with a lot of folks who are aging, and knowing usually what happens is they come back to me, they said, oh, I used to love singing and I haven't sung for 15 years and it just doesn't sound the same as it used to. And I think what they're usually looking for is how much of what I used to be able to do can I get back? And that's a really challenging question to answer from any perspective, because I don't know what their baseline was, and I don't know really what their tissues are capable of at this time. And so my question is, I'm getting around sort of a roundabout way to get to this, but it's a question of motivation and how do we keep our students and our singers engaged in the process when we can't necessarily guarantee them an outcome, right? We can't necessarily say, yes, you will be able to do this. And as you said earlier on, it's a messy process that oftentimes takes a lot of frustrating experimentation of not producing the sound that you want. So I'm always interested in anybody's insight that you have on how do you keep them engaged in that process?
Yeah, you know what? One of the things that I've looked at in recent years is my lesson process and almost why I get away with the things I get away with. Because, and the reason for that is when I do teaching observation with the teachers that I work with, quite often their comment to me is, you stay on that subject much longer than I would. And that's because I've seen the process enough times that I know I know this takes a while. I know this is a messy process, but I'm confident that we'll find something of value at the end of it. And I don't always know what that is, but I'm just happy going forth into it, right? It usually pays off in some way. But also because the process along the way, I try to make as unboring as possible. So we do a lot of discussion. I don't take up every moment of the lesson with pedagogy. I love to take them off in different directions and then bring them back. And quite often what I'm doing with that is I'm keeping the mood light, but the other purpose of me taking them off, getting a bit jovial, we'll share a bit of a joke. I can stay on the same subject for like 60 minutes and they're not annoyed with me. Because I do keep it light, but we tend to bring it back. And when I get people talking, I bring it back after 3 minutes. And the purpose of that 3 minutes was not actually to find out about their holiday.
Yeah.
It was to make them forget what we just covered. Because what I want them to do is recall it. That's my main goal. I don't want repeat. I want repeat, forget, repeat.
Yeah, yeah.
That's my learning goal for those people. And if they can do that enough times within the lesson, they're also like, oh, and it doesn't need to be a great big goal. It can just be something they've discovered. And they're like, yes, I feel that. Yes, I feel that. And as long as I can relate that back to something goal orientated, so motivation is related to goals, of course. And if the goals aren't defined and if they aren't chunked up a little bit, so we can spot progress, then of course demotivation can come in. So I think it is an element of like rapport. It's an element of keeping it light and not making it heavy. An element of learning that helps them to see, yes, see, you're finding it again, you're finding it again, you're finding it again. And if I just put that in this song here, this is this part of this song, even though it seemed unrelated 2 minutes ago, but I will endeavor to link that to your goal before we do anything. Otherwise, I'll send you away and say, just trust me. That doesn't really work. Well, it does for some people, but a lot of people are like, I don't want to trust you. You need to show me what the point of this is. And I will always do that. So I find people do stay motivated in that environment. So yeah, I just think that just try not to keep it too heavy.
Chris, we can't let you go without discussing the ghost, because Lynn and I were privy to the fun ghost exercise, and somehow it has not appeared yet today. It sounded like that was a tool that you use quite a bit to help with mix exploration.
That's right. Yeah, and I think if the principle of ghost, you know, as in ooh, it's the principle of ghost is just a shaky sound, right? Everything is wibbling around. So if we look at it, it sort of boils itself down to vibrato is integral to that sound. Vibrato is an interaction of the muscles and the functions we're talking about today that helps someone achieve a mixed register, whatever it is, right? Or a passaggio that is erased. That means vibrato is an incredible tool by which you can avoid any of those muscles, the CT and TA, as they try and find the right tension and adduction to a degree. You can avoid those things from overpowering each other because vibrato doesn't let either one just completely take over. right? So if that's why a lot of people often, I'm sure, intuitively use vibrato, because they know if they didn't, their voice would be a pain in the bum, right? It'd be annoying to get up to those pitches. So if we take vibrato, yes, vibrato is an amazing leveler, and the frequency of vibrato, slower, probably involving more of that muscle thickness and adduction. Faster, maybe that's going towards those thinner settings, maybe closer towards the mix that people are after sometimes. Faster, I mean like 6 per second, something like that, maybe slightly faster. Then if we take that forward, we go, well, what characters can I use? Because vibrato is cool, but character for me is more valuable because it actually increases the energy of that person in their whole body. It's not just a voice event. This is a whole event. This is me. I'm delivering it in a way. And so when I take a few voice qualities and characters where vibrato is inherent, a ghost is inherent. From 𝘱𝘳, I take something called radiance, which is where it's like, I'm really excited. I can't wait to get my Christmas present. I'm just so like that, right? It's like, yeah, it's usually have a rapid vibrato, but between those two, one's a bit brighter and more contemporary, and often one's a bit like, I guess, darker and more loose. They both have their value in getting up to the part where the voice normally breaks, but avoiding the break. And so they become very useful, especially because usually everybody's difficulty is ascending through the break, right? Something like that. And ooh, often like that. You know, those kind of things. But if you're ghostly, ooh, it's all wibbling. They just forget about the break. You just be a ghost, and the craziest ass ghost you could be. That will be wonderful. And so that can be such a wonderful, very quick, by the way, as well, way to help somebody feel like, again, the language can be good, but to help them feel like the notes just pass through them. They're not trying to do anything with them. The ghost as well, the ghost would have a looser closure than the excited child one. So, but either way, if you keep the vibrato or the wobble consistent and the character consistent, that can also keep the level of closure or close quotient through the break within a more consistent range. And when anybody ever does that, regardless if they're in chest voice, head voice, whatever they're in, if close quotient has remained at a similar level between low and high, again, we perceive no break. So that's why the importance of keeping the character at the same intensity across that. The ghost or the excited child performs so many functions to keep that singer consistent, and then you can just start to reduce the amount that you use across a week or something.
Is the ghost a scale or just making these sounds across a range? Do you do it in a
sounds? Yeah. So you know,
because child, what the excited child again? Make that sound.
It's a bit like so it's if you first see it as an energy or like if you were going to get a present at Christmas and you just like, the lid is on my excitement, but I'm just desperate to get it. And if anybody wants to see an example of a singer that embodies these kind of emotions, right? If you've ever watched Jessie J do her like really fast runs, and in the early days when she used to do acoustic live lounges, when she gets into those like high places and those riffy kind of quick places, she goes into that, like the shoulders go up a little bit, she shakes all over, and the voice and the vibrato expresses that. The vibrato goes a bit faster and she becomes more nimble. And so she either she's learned that or it just sort of feeds back. She's in that place. She's a wonderful example of someone who does that. Equally, when she's like smooth, she also does a lot of swaying. And that dovetails with some of the 𝘱𝘳 stuff as well, which is called buoyancy, which is where you get kind of like, I guess that would be closer to ghost. Oh, you know, that kind of loose feel goes along with body swaying and wafting of arms, for example. So yeah, there are some really cool examples of singers who use excited childlike sounds or even ghostly sounds.
And what was that name? Jessica J? Is that who?
Jessie J? Yeah, Jessie J. She's I think amongst the singers, she's a connoisseur. She's for the connoisseurs out there usually.
Okay. There's a wonderful question. It's extensive, but let's just take a minute from Theodora Nestorova. I'm so glad you mentioned vibrato as a stabilizing factor in mixing, Chris. And I'm curious your thoughts on the CT-TA interplay for the different vibrato rates and extents and genre-specific vibrato as a tool in mixed registration training and then isolation.
Oh, that is a big one. Yes. So where do we start with that? The TACT was the first mention, right, of detail.
Yeah, thoughts on CT interplay for different vibrato rates and extents, and then genre-specific vibrato as a tool in mixed registration training.
Okay, yeah. So the TA, and this comes from research that actually comes from 𝘕𝘈𝘛𝘚 as well on vibrato, and if in that theory vibrato is a bouncing signal in the nervous system, and involving the TA and the CT. And when you get that signal bouncing through the latency that happens in the brain and the muscles themselves and the nervous system, it tends to end up at the rate of regular vibrato, which is 5 to 6 per second, right? But when the TA, let's say, is more activated, and that might be when you're more chesty, or at greater intensities where that same chesty muscle or closure is activated, that would tend to slow the vibrato rate down quite a bit, which is why when you hear Frank Sinatra, my way, you can really get this wide extent and slower rate of vibrato. So that would suggest that that singer is, say, utilizing more intensity, maybe a little bit more closure that's gained from the TA, and then you get a slower vibrato rate. Also, when breath flow is really slow, when singers tend to not have enough breath flow, that can trigger the same thing at the larynx, because when breath pressure is or breath flow drops to a certain rate, the larynx likes to switch to a setting that works better with low airflow, and quite often that results in high adduction. So singers who have lower breath flow, they often experience slower vibrato in that sense. But when you speed that breath flow up for singers, you'd often see that the vibrato rate increases because the level of adduction decreases. And when that decreases, it allows the CT to kind of participate more in that vibrato and stop the TA from slowing it down. So yes, when you tend to get to those thinner registers, maybe that are living on a lighter adduction, the vibrato rate tends to slow down, tends to speed up, considerably. And then when you put excitement into the mix, you get an even faster rate of vibrato. So that's how I see those, and they can be quite easily played with, again, with characters. The ghost vibrato is definitely slower than the excited child, because it tends to be used with that slightly thicker and a lower larynx, which can also encourage a bit of a thicker fold as well.
That was a great answer to a complicated question at the end. So
I hope I covered it. I don't know if I did, but yeah, thank you.
Well, what a great way to end this season's NATS chats. Chris, you are not only extremely knowledgeable, but extremely delightful. So we're so grateful for your time and generosity of expertise today. And Lynn, as always, I'm thrilled I just always ask Lynn when I just need somebody on that really knows the science in a profound way and can speak up and speak the truth and keep me on track. So
I appreciate the opportunity, Kari. Thank you. And you certainly could have covered anything I covered today. Thank you.
Not true, but thank you. Well, I'm fast at work or hard at work already for next season's NATS chat, and have some wonderful guests already on the line. So stay tuned. By August, we'll have that information published, and hopefully have another wonderful season. But in the meantime, I hope to see many of you in Knoxville. Lynn and I will be doing an SOVT systematic approach presentation called Grasping at Straws. So please come to our session, 7:45 on a Sunday morning. Not thrilled about that, but we'll be there with bells on. because that'll be 4:45 my time, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, please come to Knoxville for a wonderful NATS conference, and have a wonderful summer, everyone. And thank you again. Chris, I should actually give you an opportunity. Any final parting words on this topic that you want to make sure our voice teachers are thinking about? I should have given you that opportunity.
Oh no, it's cool. I mean, yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a great chat. I've really enjoyed it. And it always, if anybody was expecting structure, I mean, you probably regret turning up now, because it's just it's hard to be structured with mixed register, isn't it? It's just all over the place. But yeah, I mean, I think really take every voice as it comes. I think when you work to principles rather than aesthetics, and you can just have a few methods by which you influence the voice on a principle level, then you'll get outcomes that are actually very different per person, and language that is different per person, and therefore you don't get locked into a methodology. And feel free, like I said, I'm a messy teacher because I'm trying to figure out how that works. And I think really the way that looks sometimes is it looks like pandemonium. And if you feel like your teaching is pandemonium, don't worry, because that can often be the sign of often the most perfect process for someone to really figure out, with all these pieces on the playground, like what is the combination I'm looking for. And when all that mess can eventually turn itself into, oh yes, that's the one, then it can form itself into structure a little bit. So yeah, I just feel like maybe that's probably a nice parting a comment.
I love that. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And sorry, one last thing. ICVT, International Congress of Voice Teachers, will be in Toronto, Canada, 2025, August. So please, our deadline for presentation abstracts is June 1st. So I'm seeing wonderful, wonderful names on the chat here. Theodora, I'm looking at you, and Dan Mitten. Please consider submitting your abstracts, and of course, Chris and Lynn. We've already discussed. So we're looking for wonderful abstracts for that conference. So thank you for a wonderful season, and have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.